Unpopular opinion. While I do think Tom Holland has done a fantastic job portraying Spider-Man, both with being incorporated into the MCU and his standalone films, he isn't my favourite Spider-Man. Why, you may ask? Hear me out. When I was growing up, every kid wanted to be Spider-Man. He'd been around long enough to be ingrained into comic book culture, but the fact that he was almost always portrayed as a young, goofy, nerdy high school kid made him relatable. Not only did we all want to be Spider-Man, but we felt like we were Peter Parker in our own worlds, in our own day-to-day lives. To me and many others, no Spider-Man is complete without his Peter Parker counterpart. Watching a nerdy, lower-class kid obtain incredible superpowers, rise to the top, all while suffering unimaginable losses due to his own gifts, having to balance this with societal pressure, a personal family life, relationships, school, a job, and more, seems near impossible. Yet it gives us a sense of realism. Now answer this honestly. If you were gifted with superhuman strength, incredible agility, the ability to stick to any surface and climb walls, and most iconically, shoot webs out of your arms, or in some case mechanically created gadgets, what would you do? Would you really venture out into the world, fighting baddies and drawing attention to yourself in the public eye, while simultaneously attracting the attention of government officials who would want to capture, abuse, or even dissect you? Or would you use your powers for your own personal benefit? Getting to and from places with ease, escaping sticky situations, no pun intended, beating up people who annoy you, maybe even making a YouTube channel dedicated to showcasing your powers to gain fame. I don't doubt that some of you would try and take the good guy avenue, but without the influence of superhero movies in our mainstream media, would you even consider it? That's where wanting to be Spider-Man fit in so well.
Remember, with great power comes great responsibility.
Now I get this line as a meme now, but think about it. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy. And yes, trilogy. Can you imagine being the only Spider-Man in almost 20 years to receive a completed trilogy? This post was made by the Sam Raimi gang. Sam Raimi's trilogy portrayed Peter Parker, as described earlier, almost perfectly, especially in Spider-Man 2. Now, while he might have dropped the ball in Spider-Man 3, ultimately resulting in a fourth film that was cancelled, the movie still held dear to its core themes of balancing life and responsibility. Peter loses his best friend, he loses the girl, but most importantly, he loses himself. Unlike in Spider-Man 2, where he loses his powers, due to the symbiote in Spider-Man 3, his powers enhance him, giving him confidence, strength, and most importantly, sick dance moves. Now, while there is an argument to be made that Tom Holland's Spider-Man adaptation draws similar parallels in regards to themes, the loss of a father figure, the loss of himself, having to make choices out of responsibility, and giving up his life as Peter Parker to be Spider-Man, it's not nearly as strong as it is in the Raimi trilogy. Tom Holland's Spider-Man is by no means bad. He is a handsome young man with extraordinary acting talent. But there is a catch. He's standing on the shoulders of giants. No, not Andrew Garfield. I mean, kudos to him. It was the producers. It wasn't his fault that Spider-Man was garbage. But Tom Holland's MCU Spider-Man is built in the MCU for the MCU. While that isn't necessarily a bad thing, it has its constraints. Now, I'm not saying that Kevin Feige is a bad writer or a producer. He has done a fantastic job with anything Marvel he's worked on. Nor am I saying that a solely Sony-produced Spider-Man movie is instantly better than anything Disney can churn out. But being in the MCU has its hindrances. For one, Disney jumped right into the already established Spider-Man universe. No Uncle Ben, no Peter Parker backstory, save the fine basics, and there was no Spider-Man themed conflicts. Now, with how Disney and the MCU chose to use Spider-Man in Civil War, I didn't disagree with per se. What I did disagree with, though, was how there wasn't enough development for me to actually care enough about him. He was there as a glorified puppet, a nostalgia treat, and as a spirit for us to guide our prayers towards a yet another Spider-Man reboot that would fill the void that Andrew Garfield left behind. I did enjoy how sparingly he was used in Civil War, but it felt like his presence was off. Yes, he was amazing. Yes, he was witty. Yes, he was still a kid. Ticks in all those categories. I loved watching him on screen, don't get me wrong, but to only have him developed and fleshed out a whole year later seemed like a cop-out to me. It almost seemed as if Disney was testing the water to see how the audience would react to Tom Holland, and frankly, it worked. People loved him. I loved him. Again, he's not a bad Spider-Man. Hell, if we're talking live-action movies, he's a very close second to Tobey Maguire. I just wish that the MCU had handled him differently. Far From Home is the Spider-Man movie I didn't think I wanted, but after seeing it, I was pleasantly surprised. Not only did they bring back the greatest part of the original Raimi trilogy, but they took us for a wild ride, just out of reach of the MCU to kind of feel like its own thing. But there were still the limitations. It wasn't really its own thing if you looked into it. It relied heavily on Tony Stark and his death, Nick Fury and the Avengers Initiative, and previously featured members of Stark Co. as villains. Now, the story itself was amazing, the visuals, fantastic, Tom Holland was perfect, and the humour was on point. but it was an MCU-built Disney Spider-Man film. It just didn't feel like classic Spidey to me. Now I know what you're thinking. That's the beauty of it, Cal. It keeps it fresh and subverts expectations. Well, yes and no. See, I'm not saying I wanted another Uncle Ben. In fact, I was grateful that they didn't rehash it again, since we all know how Spidey got his powers and the progression of his superhero lifestyle. More on that later, but without a solid story to anchor itself into, independent of the MCU, this Spider-Man is kind of a lost cause. Now I'm gonna say something that is gonna cut me a lot of flack. First of all, I'd like to preface it by saying, if you enjoy Marvel movies, or any superhero movies for that matter, no matter how old you are, 9 or 99, good for you. You enjoy what you want, never let anyone take that away from you. Unless you're a furry, or into feet. God bless Tarantino. Who is the main market for superhero merchandise? It's kids. Now that doesn't negate the adults or teens who also purchase Spider-Man merch, I'm one myself, but they make up a much smaller percentage of the market. Keep in mind, Disney earns all the money from merchandising MCU Spidey, so of course, they're going to target it towards a younger demographic. Enter the Disney-Sony contract. Exactly 20 years ago, Sony purchased Spider-Man off Marvel for an estimated $25 million, and in 2009, Disney bought Marvel for a $4 billion contract. Disney kept asking Sony to buy the rights of Spider-Man for years and years after that, until in 2014 a deal was struck where Spider-Man was loaned to Disney under the terms that Sony kept 95% of the profits from anything Spider-Man related, and they only made 5 movies with the selected actor. Disney agreed, but only after opting to get the rights to all the earnings from the merch made, which Sony reluctantly agreed to. Tom Holland's Spidey was a huge success, earning Sony over $1.8 billion with Homecoming and Far From Home, not to mention his Civil War, Infinity War, and Endgame roles. Disney obviously caught on, and being the money scumbags they are, they tried to strike a counteroffer with Sony. They asked for 50% of MCU Spider-Man earnings, 10 times that of the current shares. Sony outright gave the finger to them and threatened to take back MCU Spider-Man, causing a freakout in the system. But tinfoil hats on, kiddies, this is where it gets serious. I have a theory. Now, we all know how much of a cultural phenomenon Spider-Man has become. He's had a second wind after the atrocity that was The Amazing Spider-Man. Again, nothing against Andrew Garfield, he himself is amazing. But having a live-action Spider-Man with everything great, the great responsibility, loss of a father figure, and the best thing about MCU Spider-Man, Tom Holland. I'm just kidding. The fact that he's actually in a cinematic universe. No Spider-Man has ever done that. I guess except Into the Spider-Verse, but that's besides the point. Or the Lego Spider-Man games. Again, don't look into it. I'm talking live action, okay? Spider-Man is a spiritual successor to everything the MCU has built, and Disney knows this. They know that by trying to get their grubby hands on Spider-Man from Sony, it would cause Sony to freak out, especially after the success of Venom and more importantly, Into the Spider-Verse. There's a lot of pressure on the company to keep the Spider-Man name alive. And it's not like Disney is short for cash. Hell, where I live, Disney movie tickets are a whole $1 more expensive than regular tickets. Now, if that doesn't sound like a lot, keep in mind, I'm a broke student, and Disney pulls out like 50 movies every year, and being a film student means I have to see them all. By the end of the year, all the extra dollars I've spent add up to like almost an entire ticket. Anyway, since they've asked for 50% of the earnings for Spidey, which is an estimated $585 million US by the next movie, and they already own the merchandising rights, of course Sony was gonna say no. But how would the fans react? My feed has been completely blown up by the news as a result. People are boycotting Sony, who think they are the responsible culprit. As a result, what do you think Sony is going to feel pressured to do? Give in. They'll give Disney their 50%, or make a counteroffer which Disney will probably reject, and it'll end up unfair anyway. Now this is where I could go on a tangent and talk about how capitalism is bad and blame all of it for this, but I ain't no libtard. I wish I could sit here and say that these two companies will put aside their differences and do what's best for the fans, their ultimate form of income would want and appreciate, but that's not how the modern world works. That's not how the cinema world works. That's not how companies like this operate. And if MCU Spider-Man does fall through, look at the positives. I know I spent a lot of this video bagging The Amazing Spider-Man, but Sony isn't necessarily to blame for the failure either. Look at Into the Spider-Verse. Sony is capable of writing and creating amazing Spider-Mans, lovable characters, and compelling stories. Want an even better example? Remember how I talked about Raimi's Spider-Man being superior, and MCU Spidey faltering due to the lack of character development that truly made him a Spider-Man? No Uncle Ben, no loss of powers, he doesn't lose the girl, etc. There is a way to execute a story that follows those tropes of an already established Peter Parker and Spider-Man with everything that makes him relatable and great. Enter the Spider-Man PS4 game. Sony created a universe where Peter Parker was the central focus of this game. He was a broke intern with a failed relationship, struggling to pay rent and spend quality time with his only family member left. but most importantly, it had J. Jonah Jameson in it. It took everything great about the Raimi Spider-Man and made them better. I've mentioned how Spider-Man 2 is my favorite, mainly due to Doc Ock, but how they portray him in this game, even if we all know how it's gonna go down, hits harder than...
I don't want to go, sir, please.
Okay, maybe not that hard, but you get the point. Hell, take the opening sequence of the game. It gives you everything Spider-Man represents and more, but even better, it shows you who Peter Parker is. How he, even as an adult, struggles to keep on top of his life, making him the most relatable character for anyone of any age. I have faith in Sony to create amazing, maybe even spectacular Spider-Man. I just hope that this Disney deal doesn't ruin any chances we have of it. And with all opinions aside, I have so much respect for Tom Holland for handling this as professionally as he did. And moreover, I really do hope they let him have one more movie, because God knows I need more J. Jonah Jameson.